The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's ICU buzzed like overhead wasps. Sarah Chen moved through the corridor at 11:13 p.m., her navy scrubs crisp against the cold air conditioning that always smelled of bleach and something underneath, copper, maybe, or just the residue of other people's suffering. She'd been walking these halls for 2 years, and nobody here knew her name. Not really. They knew her as the quiet one. The efficient one. The robot nurse, as Dr. Sterling had started calling her. The night shift suited her. Fewer people. Fewer questions. The ICU ward at Mercy General stretched out like a cathedral of machines, each bed surrounded by the steady percussion of monitors, the wheeze of ventilators, the soft hiss of oxygen lines. Sarah's eyes catalogued exits as she walked, the main corridor, the emergency stairwell at the south end, the loading dock through the back hallway. Habit. 8 years of muscle memory that wouldn't shut off even when she was just pushing a medication cart. She started her rounds at room 8, then 9, then 10. Each patient chart reviewed with the kind of precision that came from reading field reports in hostile territory. Her handwriting was flawless, controlled, each note dated, timed, initialed. At 11:53 p.m. she paused at the nurse's station and her right hand unconsciously moved to her ribs. Through the fabric of her scrubs, her fingers traced the outline of something small, rectangular, sewn into the jacket lining underneath. A faded unit patch. The colors had bled into each other over 18 years, the insignia barely readable. She kept it there the way other people kept photographs. Not to remember. To forget the forgetting. Her left leg ached. It always ached after standing for 6 hours, a dull throb that started at the shin and radiated upward. The shrapnel had come out in 3 surgeries at Landstuhl. The pain was just information now. Data to catalog and file away. The medication cart clicked and rattled as she pushed it to room 11. The sound made her jaw tighten. Too loud. She gripped the cart handle tighter to steady her hands, keeping them flat against the cold metal. The tremor passed. It always did. Dr. Sterling arrived at the ICU entrance at 11:58 p.m., his shoes clicking against the tile like a metronome counting down to something. His name was stitched into his white coat in expensive embroidery. His watch cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. She noticed these things not because she cared but because noticing kept her alive. His eyes swept across the ward, cataloguing inefficiencies, rooms that weren't dark enough, beds that weren't aligned properly. Then they landed on her. She was standing in the doorway of room 12, scanning the space before she entered. Her head moved in a slow methodical sweep, left to right, ceiling to floor, corner to corner. Like she was photographing the room. Like she was mapping exits. Sterling watched her for exactly 4 seconds before turning away. Something about the way she moved bothered him. Too controlled. Too purposeful. A nurse was supposed to hustle, to shuffle, to look harried. Sarah Chen looked like she was clearing a compound. By 12:17 a.m., Sarah had reviewed the medication administration records for all 18 patients on the ICU floor. It was during this quiet review that her eyes caught something that didn't fit. Room 14's chart showed an order for 18 units of specialized pressure monitoring equipment, the kind that cost $4,800 each. The kind that was only necessary for post-operative cardiac patients. The patient in room 14 was a 23-year-old Marine named Marcus Webb. Recovering from shrapnel wounds. Stable vitals for 3 days. The equipment order didn't make clinical sense. She pulled the charts for rooms 6, 9, and 13. Same pattern. Equipment ordered but never actually documented as used. Billing codes applied. But when she cross-referenced the actual nursing notes, her notes, where every single action was recorded with military precision, the equipment hadn't been attached to the patients. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up the supply chain records. Her heart had started moving faster, but her face remained blank. This was the part of her that couldn't turn off. The part that had spent 4 tours in Kandahar looking for patterns that didn't fit. The patterns that got people killed if you missed them. In the cafeteria break room at 12:34 a.m., Sterling was making a phone call. His voice was low, the kind of low that meant he didn't want to be overheard, but he was standing in a room with an open doorway and Sarah had just come in to pour coffee. She heard 3 words: billing reconciliation delay. She heard him laugh. She didn't stay long enough to hear anything else. Professional distance. The ability to listen to something and not be heard listening. Another thing 18 years of training had taught her. The coffee was old and tasted like it had been sitting for 6 hours. She drank it anyway, standing at the counter, her posture perfect, her mind processing what she'd heard against what she'd seen in the charts. By 12:41 a.m. she was back on the floor. Room 14 was where she moved slower. Sarah stood in the doorway for exactly 5 seconds, scanning. The young Marine was asleep, his dark hair matted against the pillow, his left shoulder wrapped in bandages from the shrapnel wound that had shredded the deltoid muscle. His right hand was missing 2 fingers. His chart said he'd been with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, deployed to Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The blast had taken his buddies instead. That was always how it worked. The random mathematics of where you were standing when the IED detonated. Sarah stepped into the room. Her movements were economical, practiced. She checked the 4-line, the monitor leads, the oxygen saturation reading. The numbers were good. Steady. The patient was stable, healing, would probably recover 80% of his range of motion if the physical therapy was aggressive enough. She was reading his chart when she saw his name again and her hands went completely still. Marcus Webb. 23 years old. Registered home address in Colorado Springs. Deployed to Helmand Province. In the photo section of his admission paperwork, there was a family history document. His mother's name was listed as deceased. A note in the history section, in someone else's handwriting, said, "Mother killed in market bombing, Kandahar, 2004. Patient age 8. Sustained minor injuries. Treated at forward operating base." The coffee cup in Sarah's other hand was heavy. She set it down on the beside table with the kind of careful control that kept it from shaking. Her breathing had changed. Not visibly. Just a slight shift in the rhythm of her exhales. The kind of thing only someone trained to hide everything would notice. She was staring at the young Marine's face now, looking for the 8-year-old boy underneath the grown features. The boy who'd been standing between the vendor stalls with his mother when the motorcycle pulled up. The boy whose mother had pushed him behind a concrete pillar and taken the blast instead. The boy Sarah had shielded with her body, her face pressed against his hair, her voice in Pashto telling him to stay still, stay quiet, help was coming. She'd never thought she'd see that boy again. After 18 years, she'd mostly stopped looking for him in crowds. But there he was. Grown up. Scarred. And sleeping 3 feet away in a hospital bed in Denver. Sarah picked up her coffee cup again. She drank the rest of it in 2 swallows and walked out of room 14 at exactly 1:03 a.m. Her hands were steady by the time she reached the nurse's station. The tremor had passed. She logged her notes, her handwriting perfect, each entry timed, each clinical observation accurate. The muscle memory of holding everything together in a vault had taken over. What happened next didn't just change the shift. It changed everything. But Sarah Chen didn't know that yet. She just knew that the boy was alive. That the boy had become a Marine. That the boy was here, in room 14, and that Dr. Sterling, who was already building something corrupt in the corner of this hospital, had just become the biggest threat to everything Sarah had worked to keep hidden. At 1:15 a.m., Sterling stood at the medication cart and watched Sarah move through her remaining rounds. She was perfect. Precise. And something about her terrified him in a way he didn't quite understand. The way she moved wasn't like a nurse. It was like something else. Something trained. Something dangerous. He smiled anyway. He had no idea what that smile was about to cost him. He smiled anyway. He had no idea what that smile was about to cost him. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Denver sunshine that made the ICU's fluorescent light seem even harsher by contrast. Dr. Sterling sat at the head of the conference table during the weekly staff meeting, his tailored charcoal suit catching the light like armor. 12 nurses and 4 residents filled the room, the air already thick with the particular exhaustion that came from overnight shifts. Sarah sat in the back corner, her pen poised over her notebook, spine straight, eyes forward. Attentive. Present. Invisible. Sterling leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy space. He glanced around the table, and his gaze snagged on Sarah like a hook finding flesh. A smile spread across his face, not the kind that reached his eyes, but the kind that suggested he'd just thought of something amusing at someone else's expense. "I'm taking bets," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the false warmth of a game show host. "How long before the robot nurse cracks?" "I give her a week. Maybe 2 if she's stubborn." Scattered uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room. The kind of laughter people made when they weren't entirely sure if they were allowed to laugh, but feared being the only one not laughing more. Sarah's pen didn't pause. One measured breath. The kind of breath a person took before disarming an explosive device, slow, controlled, pulling in information without emotion. She kept her eyes on her notepad, but her peripheral vision caught the ripple of glances sliding toward her like curious fish. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the words. The room shifted uncomfortably around her silence, and that silence was its own kind of power, though Sterling was too intoxicated with his own cleverness to notice. By Tuesday morning, Sterling had escalated. Sarah was reaching for a fresh case of sterile 18-gauge for catheters in the supply room when Sterling appeared in the doorway. His presence didn't announce itself with aggression, it was subtler than that. A shift in air pressure. The kind of casual blocking that suggested he'd simply happened to stop by the same moment she needed to leave. "You question my equipment orders again, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a register meant to sound confidential, "and you'll be checking vitals at a clinic in Aurora. The kind with 3 examination rooms and a waiting room that smells like wet dog." He was close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne layered over something else, the faint chemical tang of obsessive hand sanitizing, of a man fighting bacteria he couldn't see and couldn't control. Sarah met his eyes. The gesture cost something. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining the precise geometry of her composure. She blinked it away and spoke in the quiet voice she'd cultivated over 2 years of invisibility, her words clipped and exact. "I only flag duplicate billing codes, Doctor. Hospital Policy. Section 4.2 of the Compliance Manual." She wasn't deferential. She wasn't angry. She was simply factual, the way someone recited coordinates to a pilot or called out vitals to an attending. The tear was already gone from her cheek. Sterling's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected to be corrected with a citation. He stepped aside, but not far enough, a deliberate invasion of space that lasted 2 seconds too long before she passed him, the fabric of their scrubs nearly brushing. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the fury he couldn't quite weaponize because she'd given him no opening, no emotion to grab onto and twist. Wednesday arrived with quiet cruelty. Sterling assigned her the 3 most difficult patients on the rotation, a post-op sepsis case with a family demanding a second opinion, a stroke patient whose daughter called the floor every 30 minutes, and an elderly man recovering from a cab who'd already fired 3 nurses for perceived slights. These were the patients families complained about. These were the assignments that generated complaints. Sterling had weaponized roster strategy. But then something unexpected happened. The post-op sepsis case began responding to Sarah's meticulous temperature management and medication timing. The stroke patient's daughter, after observing Sarah's precise attention to her mother's comfort, actually called Sterling's office to praise her. The elderly cardiac patient asked specifically for Sarah on Thursday night because, he said, she actually listens instead of just nodding. Sterling read the feedback note and his response came immediately, a written evaluation in Sarah's file citing attitude problems and boundary issues with patients, claiming she was overstepping her role by making clinical recommendations that should have come from physicians. The language was careful, Professional, weaponized. It was the kind of documentation that would look devastating in an investigation. But Thursday was when Sterling stopped calculating and started performing. The cafeteria at 11:27 a.m. on Thursday was packed with the overlap shift, night nurses finishing their rotation, day nurses arriving with fresh energy, residents grabbing coffee before afternoon rounds. 40 witnesses. Sterling had probably counted them. Sarah sat at a small table near the window, eating a turkey sandwich on whole wheat, a cup of soup cooling beside it. She was reading something on her phone, a text from her daughter Emma asking what time she'd be home. Dr. Sterling walked directly toward her table. The room noticed. The ambient noise of conversation didn't drop, but it changed frequency, like a predator entering a space and every living thing registering the shift in the air pressure. He looked at her lunch tray with theatrical disgust, the kind of expression a man would make if he discovered an insect in his food. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieter cafeteria. "You're good at cleaning up messes." His hand swept out in a gesture that was almost casual, and her lunch tray flew. The plate clattered. The soup cup hit the edge of the table and spilled across the linoleum floor in a spreading stain the color of rust. The sandwich scattered. Papers flew. Sterling dropped a patient chart at her feet, deliberately, the cover open so papers would scatter. The gesture was practiced, theatrical, performed for the room full of witnesses. The cafeteria went dead silent. Sarah took one measured breath. The kind of breath a person took when every muscle was calculating whether to move, whether to react, whether to let the thing that lived underneath her skin wake up. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. Not from shame. Not from pain. From the crushing effort of staying still when movement lived in her bones like muscle memory. She bent down slowly. Collected each scattered paper with precise movements, no rushing, no fumbling. The turkey sandwich, the plastic wrap, the napkins. Each item placed deliberately on the overturned tray. The silence stretched like a living thing, and she could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes like physical pressure. She rose to meet Sterling's eyes without breaking contact as she wiped the tear away with the back of her hand. Her voice when she spoke was absolutely steady, quiet enough that only Sterling could hear it clearly, though the room held its breath to listen. "I've been called worse by better men, Doctor." The words landed like a blade. Not a threat. Not defiance. Simply a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of calm that suggested a person who had lived through things that made a spilled soup bowl seem almost quaint. Sterling's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, long enough for Sarah to see that he'd heard something in her voice that didn't belong to a night shift nurse in scrubs. He turned and walked away, his jaw working like he was grinding something between his teeth. What neither of them noticed was the young Marine in room 14 of the ICU, visible through the observation window that faced the cafeteria. Marcus Webb stood in his hospital gown, one arm still bandaged from shrapnel extraction, his eyes locked on the scene. Something shifted in his face, recognition, but not of the present moment. Recognition of something buried in his cells, a memory that lived deeper than conscious thought. He'd been 8 years old in Kandahar when a market bombing collapsed everything. He remembered smoke. He remembered the roar. He remembered hands, steady, strong hands, covering his body, a voice saying something he couldn't hear because of the ringing in his ears. He'd been evacuated by American forces 2 days later. He'd never seen the face of the woman who saved him. But he remembered her voice. He remembered the coordinates tattooed on her forearm, visible for just a moment when she reached up to shield him from falling debris. Those same coordinates were now visible on the forearm of the night shift nurse who'd just been humiliated in the cafeteria. By Friday morning, Dr. Sterling had transformed from a man enjoying psychological dominance into something more dangerous, a man protecting an empire. His 3-year arrangement with Apex Medical Supply had generated $47,000 in kickback commissions. The duplicate billing codes Sarah had flagged, the ones he dismissed as her obsession with protocol, were the infrastructure of that arrangement. If anyone conducted a real investigation, if anyone pulled the actual invoices against what had actually been ordered, the geometry of his fraud would become visible. Sterling placed 3 calls from his office on Friday between 8:24 a.m. and 8:16 a.m. The first went to Janet Wilcox, the hospital board president, a carefully worded expression of concern about a nurse with questionable credentials making clinical decisions that were arguably beyond her scope of practice. The second went to the HR director, requesting a full background verification and mentioning, almost casually, that her previous employer, Rocky Mountain Clinic, had no online presence, which seemed suspicious. The third went to his contact at the Colorado Board of Nursing with a suggestion that an investigation into unauthorized medical procedures might be warranted. By noon Friday, Sterling had scheduled a meeting with hospital administration for Monday morning. He'd already contacted Thomas Chen, an outside investigator from a firm that owed Sterling referrals, and provided him with Sarah's employment history, her equipment order objections, and her unusually military bearing. The frame was being built around her. Quietly. Methodically. But something else was happening in parallel, something Sterling didn't know about. Sarah noticed the small sabotages by Friday afternoon, her shift assignments changed without notice, her access to certain medication dispensaries suddenly requiring supervisor override, residents who'd previously respected her now avoiding eye contact in the hallway. These were the kinds of details that most people wouldn't notice, but Sarah had spent 12 years reading environments for threats. She noticed. She found Marcus Webb watching her during evening rounds. The Marine sat up in his hospital bed, post-operative pain medication making his movements careful, deliberate. His eyes tracked her as she checked his pulse, measured his oxygen saturation, recorded his vitals on the chart. Something unreadable lived in his expression, not hostility, but intensity. "You should know something," Marcus said quietly, his voice still rough from the intubation during surgery. "Whatever's coming, whatever somebody's trying to do to you here, you don't face it alone." Sarah's hands paused. She was checking the foresight on his wrist, the area already beginning to bruise in the shape of a question mark. She didn't look up. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Marcus said. "The tattoo on your forearm. 34.54 degrees north, 69.23 degrees east. Kandahar. That's not random. And you move like someone who's trained to notice things. Someone who's been trained to survive." Sarah finished her assessment and moved a step back, but Marcus's unbandaged hand caught her wrist. Not hard. Just enough to hold her attention. "There was a bombing. I was 8 years old. Market in Kandahar. A woman covered me with her body. I was evacuated by SAW pilots, but I never knew her name. I never knew who saved me." He released her wrist. "I know now." That evening, Sarah's 12-year-old daughter Emma found her sitting at the kitchen table at 7:15 p.m., still in her scrubs, the overhead light making everything look harder than it was. "You're tense," Emma said, pulling out the chair across from her. Kids could always tell. Sarah forced a smile, the kind that required specific muscle groups to activate, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Just work stress, honey. Nothing I can't handle." But her hands shook as she made dinner, and she triple-checked the locks on every door and window before bed, and she lay awake listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, categorizing each one the way she'd been trained: wind, neighbor's dog, traffic 3 blocks away, Emma breathing steadily in the next room. By 2:17 a.m., Sarah was still awake, staring at the ceiling, understanding with absolute clarity that the frame Sterling was building wasn't just about her career. It was about silencing her before she could expose him. And Monday morning, when the investigators arrived, the campaign would shift from humiliation to something far more clinical and far more destructive. The alarm started at 2:08 a.m. 3 short bursts, then continuous. Room 11. Sarah was at the nursing station reviewing discharge summaries when the monitor spiked, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 94. 88. 82. She moved before the second alarm sounded, her body already rising from the chair with the fluid precision of someone whose training lived deeper than conscious thought. The patient was Marcus's roommate, a 56-year-old construction foreman named David Chen, no relation to Sarah, who'd come in 3 days ago for an emergent thoracotomy after a fall from scaffolding had punctured his right lung. Post-op day 2 should have been routine, pain managed, chest tube draining serosanguineous fluid, vitals stable. Except vitals weren't stable anymore. Oxygen saturation fell to 78 as Sarah pushed through the doorway. The patient's neck veins were distending like dark cords, his face taking on the dusky purple of someone whose lungs were collapsing inward, his trachea visibly shifted to the right. Tension pneumothorax. The chest tube had dislodged. Sarah's hands moved on their own. She called for the crash cart, not a request, a command, and turned to the monitor. The patient's heart rate had climbed to 142, his blood pressure dropping with each failing breath, 118/72, 110/68, 102/64. The clock in her mind was precise. 90 seconds. Maybe less. Cardiac arrest was coming if the pressure in his chest wasn't released. She didn't wait for Dr. Sterling. She didn't wait for orders. The emergency supply cart was 3 steps away. Her hands grabbed the large-bore needle, 14-gauge angiocath, an antiseptic swab. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She prepped the skin with one sure motion, her muscle memory overriding the present moment and pulling her backward into a small clinic in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, where she'd done this exact procedure on a 14-year-old boy who'd caught shrapnel from an IED market bombing. That boy had lived for 7 minutes after the decompression. She'd held his hand for all of them. She would not lose this man. The needle went in. She felt the resistance of the chest wall, then the sudden give as the needle broke through into the pleural space. Air rushed out with a hiss that filled the entire room, a sound like a tire deflating, like pressure escaping, like a wound being released. The patient's trachea shifted back to midline. His color returned from dusky purple to pale pink. His oxygen saturation climbed 82%, 87%, 90%, 93%. His blood pressure steadied 108/65. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 98 in the space of 4 seconds. The room exhaled with him. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, still pulling on his white coat, his hair uncombed, his face creased with sleep. He'd been called from home. He took in the scene in one sweep, the needle in the patient's chest, the monitor showing climbing oxygen saturation, the color returning to a man's face like paint filling a canvas. And then his eyes moved to Sarah. His gaze dropped to her hands. Then to her face. What he saw there wasn't admiration. It was calculation. Sarah was already documenting, time of intervention, 2:49 a.m. Patient presenting with acute tension pneumothorax. Chest tube dislodged. Emergency needle decompression performed at second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Vitals stabilized. She kept her voice level, her handwriting precise. Each letter formed with the discipline of someone who understood that paperwork was survival. Sterling didn't ask if the patient was all right. He didn't thank her. He didn't even look at David Chen anymore. He stood in the doorway with his phone already in his hand, and Sarah watched as he typed something, read it, then stepped back into the hallway. She heard his voice through the doorway, low and urgent and filled with something that sounded like triumph. "Janet, it's Sterling. I need to report a critical compliance violation. The night shift nurse, Chen, just performed a surgical procedure without physician authorization. Emergency decompression for pneumothorax. Yes, a large-bore needle. No, she's not a physician assistant. She's an RN. No physician supervision." A pause. "I understand the liability implications. She needs to be suspended immediately pending a full investigation into her scope of practice. Yes, I can provide documentation." She documented it herself in the patient chart, admission of guilt. Another pause, longer this time. "Thank you, Janet. I'll make sure she doesn't leave before security arrives for shift change." Sarah's hands had stopped moving. The pen was still in her fingers. The chart was still open on the bedside table. She was still in the room. David Chen's oxygen saturation held steady at 94. His monitor showed a clean sinus rhythm. The color in his face was the color of living. Sterling appeared in the doorway again, his phone lowered, his expression carrying the kind of satisfaction that looked like a smile with all the warmth removed. "You just ended your career, sweetheart. That's what we call practicing beyond your scope. That's what we call a felony in this state." He looked at the patient. "Lucky for him you knew what you were doing. Unlucky for you that you did it in a place with cameras and a full medical record." Sarah didn't respond. The composure that had carried her through 20 years of military service, through deployments where a trembling hand meant a team member died, through Kandahar and Helmand and forward operating bases where failure meant body bags, that composure was cracking like ice under pressure. Not from Sterling's words. From the needle still in her hands. From the memory of a 14-year-old boy in Sanjin Valley whose eyes had gone distant even after the decompression worked. From the knowledge that she had saved this man's life doing the one thing the Navy had trained her to do best, and it was going to destroy her. Her vision blurred slightly. Once. Just once. She blinked it clear. "Your shift ends in 3 hours, Sterling said. Security will meet you at the staff exit. You'll surrender your badge and your credentials. There's an HR investigation now. I'm obligated to notify the State Nursing Board of scope violations." He paused, savoring it. "You might have just lost your license, Chen. All because you couldn't follow protocol." David Chen was breathing steadily. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of a man whose lungs were inflating with oxygen, whose heart was pumping in steady time, whose color was the color of someone who would see Monday morning. Sarah had given him that. She had given him Monday morning, and Tuesday, and however many mornings he had left. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Sterling watching her realize it, watching her understand that the one skill that made her dangerous was the one skill that was going to bury her. He stepped back into the hallway, already dialing his phone again, already moving to the next phase of whatever plan he was executing. And Sarah stood alone with a patient she'd saved and a career that was ending in 3 hours. She looked at David Chen. His eyes were open now, aware, grateful. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough from intubation and pain medication. "I don't know how I'll ever thank you." "You just rest," Sarah said, and her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. The composure held. "You're going to be fine." It wasn't a lie. He was going to be fine. That was the cruelest part of all. The kitchen was too quiet. 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and Sarah Chen sat at the table in her scrubs, still damp from the shift that had ended 3 hours early, staring at nothing. Her hands trembled on the laminate surface, a betrayal of nerve she hadn't permitted herself to feel in 20 years. The house smelled like the chicken she'd planned to cook for Emma's homework night, a future that no longer existed. She couldn't stop the tears. Silent. Relentless. The kind that came from somewhere deeper than grief. The front door opened. Emma burst through with the chaotic energy of a 12-year-old who'd spent the afternoon at her best friend's house, her backpack slung sideways, her braids coming loose. She stopped cold when she saw her mother at the kitchen table, shoulders curved inward like someone trying to fold into herself. "Mom." Emma's voice pitched higher, the uncertainty of childhood flooding back. "Why are you home? What happened?" Sarah tried to straighten. Tried to find the mask. It didn't come. The composure that had carried her through for combat tours, through midnight surgeries, through the daily annihilation of pretending to be ordinary, it shattered like tempered glass under pressure. She opened her mouth. Closed it. What words existed for this? Just a bad day at work, baby. Emma was no fool. She was Sarah Chen's daughter, which meant she had inherited a capacity to read silences and understand what wasn't said. She dropped her backpack, moved to her mother, wrapped her arms around Sarah's neck. "You never have bad days," she whispered. "You never cry." Sarah held her daughter and couldn't answer. Couldn't explain that the bad day was the culmination of every choice she'd made trying to bury herself, the decorated career abandoned, the Navy Cross ceremony she'd refused to attend because accepting it meant becoming visible, meant stepping back into the light where things could break you. The PTSD that had driven her into anonymity, into scrubs, into a night shift where she could heal broken people without revealing that she was the most broken of all. That evening, Sterling called an emergency staff meeting. The conference room at Mercy General filled like a theater before a curtain rise, 63 hospital employees occupying every chair, lining the walls. Nurses whispered to residents. Technicians exchanged glances with administrative staff. There was electricity in the air, the kind that comes from knowing something significant was about to happen, though nobody quite understood what. Sterling stood at the front, papers arranged before him with the precision of a prosecution exhibit. His suit was immaculate. His smile was a knife. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he began, his voice carrying the certainty of a man about to bury someone. "This hospital has a responsibility to protect patient safety above all other considerations. Which is why, effective immediately, Sarah Chen has been terminated for practicing medicine without a license, falsifying employment records, and reckless endangerment of a patient." The words hung in the recycled air. Sarah stood against the back wall, in her civilian clothes now, having changed out of her scrubs in the locker room 3 hours earlier. She felt the collective stare of the staff rotate toward her. 63 pairs of eyes. 63 judgments. Her jaw tightened. Nothing moved in her face. Sterling continued. The emergency needle decompression procedure she performed Friday morning constituted an authorized surgical intervention. The patient could have been harmed. She exceeded the scope of nursing practice. The state board has been notified. Security will escort her from the premises immediately. He glanced at the 2 uniformed officers positioned by the conference room door. They were looking at Sarah with the discomfort of people asked to evict someone who'd never caused them trouble. "These are serious violations," Sterling said, turning back to address the room. "This is what happens when we fail to maintain boundaries." The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous electricity. Nobody spoke. The silence was the kind you could operate in. Then the doors burst open. 2 federal agents wheeled in a hospital stretcher, the patient on it heavily sedated, restrained at the wrists and ankles with soft leather cuffs. His chest rose and fell in measured increments. His eyes were closed. And then, without warning, his eyes snapped open, wild, bloodshot, locked directly on Sarah Chen. He began to scream. The first sounds were Pashto, guttural and terrified, words that tumbled out in a fever pitch. Then English, broken but unmistakable, his voice rising to a shriek that filled the conference room, the shadow of Kandahar. "She is here. The senior chief who cannot be killed. The one who destroyed Ahmadi's network. The one who—" One of the federal agents moved to sedate him again, but Sarah's hand rose, a single gesture that cut through the chaos like a scalpel. She shook her head. "Let him speak." The room had gone absolutely silent. Even Sterling's certainty had fractured. The staff stared at Sarah, then at the screaming man on the stretcher, then back at Sarah, trying to construct logic from pieces that didn't fit. Marcus Webb stepped forward. He was wearing his hospital gown, the edges of his bandaged shoulders visible, for lines still taped to his arm. He moved with the precision of someone raised in military families, despite his youth. His voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute authority of statement of fact. "That senior chief petty officer Chen, sir." Sarah's hands trembled for the first time, and she clasped them together. One of the federal agents, the woman, with grave eyes and insignia she didn't immediately process, stepped toward her and extended a classified file. The red stamp on the folder read "Eyes only. Top secret. No phone." Sarah's hands shook as she took it, her eyes scanning the pages, mission reports, casualty assessments, operation dates and coordinates, the intelligence that had defined her final deployment. The FBI agent addressed the room, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from federal credentials and absolute clarity. This patient is Hassan Khalid, wanted for attacks on U.S. forces in Kandahar province. He was captured in Syria 3 weeks ago. He recognizes Senior Chief Chen from combat operations in 2004. Senior Chief, a resident whispered. Someone's phone was already out, hands moving with the muscle memory of the internet age. The sound came next, a sound that transcended everything else. The distinctive thunder of military helicopter rotors landing on the hospital's emergency helipad, the rotor wash so powerful it rattled the windows in their frames. The fluorescent lights flickered. The sound was the sound of a different authority arriving. Boots on tile. Synchronized. Precise. A man in dress blues entered the conference room, his uniform so crisp it looked weaponized, his rank insignia indicating a Navy SEAL commander, his face arranged in an expression of controlled fury. He stopped precisely 3 feet from Sarah Chen and came to parade rest, the kind of stance that belonged to ceremony. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, he said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, low and restrained and absolutely dangerous. The room erupted. Whispers became exclamations. A nurse gasped. Marcus Webb spoke again, louder this time, his voice steady despite the tremor in his shoulders. Senior Chief Chen, Naval Special Warfare, SEAL Team Support Command. For combat deployments. Staff members were pulling out phones now, already searching. Someone found an article. Then another. Photos of Sarah in dress whites, citations, official Navy records. Oh my God, a nurse breathed. Oh my God, there are medals. The SEAL commander pulled out a citation folder, official, unlaminated and bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. Senior Chief Chen earned 2 silver stars, he said, each word a deliberate percussion strike. A bronze star with valor. And a purple heart across for combat deployments. He opened the folder. Silver Star for actions on the 15th of March, 2004, personally extracted 17 friendly personnel under fire while sustaining combat injuries. Bronze Star with valor for single-handedly maintaining a defensive position for 4 hours against enemy combatants, enabling civilian evacuation. Sarah couldn't breathe. The air had become something solid. A nurse in the front row was crying. Residents were standing now, phones out, finding photographs, articles about the Shadow of Kandahar, a legendary operator whose real name had been classified for 20 years. Janet Wilcox, the hospital board president, had gone absolutely pale, backing away from Sterling as though proximity to him had become contagious. The FBI agent stepped closer to the assembled staff. Senior Chief Chen's final mission resulted in the dismantling of the largest improvised explosive device network in Kandahar province. She identified and neutralized Omodi's entire supply chain. That single operation prevented attacks responsible for 63 American deaths and 147 civilian casualties. Sterling tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. No sound came out. The doors opened again. A Navy admiral entered, flanked by hospital board members and 3 local news camera crews. Their lights flooded the conference room, transforming it from an ordinary space into something televised, something permanent. The admiral's voice was ice in a leather uniform. Dr. Sterling, you are hereby relieved of all duties, effective immediately, for the wrongful termination of a decorated Naval Special Warfare operator. Your credentials are under investigation by the State Medical Board and the FBI. Sterling's face had gone the color of old plaster. The admiral turned to address the camera crews, the hospital staff, the permanent record. Senior Chief Chen voluntarily stepped away from active duty to pursue medical service. She has saved more lives in this hospital than most of you will in your entire careers. She has done so without recognition, without seeking status, without allowing her past to define her present. That is the definition of integrity. Marcus Webb walked to Sarah. He was still in his hospital gown, still carrying the fragility of recent injury, but he moved like a Marine anyway. He came to attention. He saluted, not the casual hand wave of civilian acknowledgement, but the full military salute, fist to chest, spine straight, eyes forward. His voice broke on the words, Kandahar market bombing, 2004. I was 8 years old. You threw yourself over me when the second device detonated. You took shrapnel meant for me. The scar I carry, it's the map of why I'm alive. He pulled up his hospital gown. Scars. Extensive scarring across his left shoulder blade and ribs, the kind that came from combat trauma, matching, in pattern and trajectory, the scars Sarah had carried since the day she'd chosen a child's life over her own body. You're the reason I became a Marine, Senior Chief, Marcus said. You're the reason I'm alive at all. Sarah was shaking now, but not from fear. 20 years of buried trauma and pride and grief collided in the space between one breath and the next. The tears came, but they were different, not the silent dissolution of her life that morning, but the shattering recognition of a truth she'd spent 2 decades trying to hide. She wasn't just a nurse. She'd never just been a nurse. And everyone in this room was about to know it. The SEAL commander gently took the classified file from her trembling hands. Sterling stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his suit suddenly looking like cosplay, his authority evaporating like water on a hot griddle. The federal agents wheeled the stretcher through the ICU entrance at 11:36 p.m., and the sedated prisoner's chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. His name was classified. His crimes were not. Sarah stood at the medication cart, restocking syringes with the precision of someone who'd performed the same motion 10,000 times, when the man's eyes snapped open like a shutter slamming. His body convulsed against the restraints. The monitors shrieked. His voice tore through the ICU in Pashto first, guttural, terrified, then English, each word collapsing into the next. The shadow of Kandahar, she is here, the senior chief who cannot be killed, she is here, she is here, she. His eyes locked on Sarah's across the room, recognition flooding his pupils, and he began screaming loud enough to make 3 nurses flinch backward. Sarah didn't move. She stood with the syringe tray still in her hands, feeling the weight of 47 sets of eyes swing toward her, feeling the fluorescent light press down like a physical thing. The man's screams continued, his body thrashing against the posy restraints, and then Marcus Webb stepped forward. He was still in his hospital gown, still moving carefully with shrapnel wounds that hadn't fully healed, but his posture straightened like someone had fed steel directly into his spine. He saluted. "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, sir," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of someone trained to speak orders into a radio while bullets flew past his ear. The room went dead silent. A Navy SEAL commander stepped through the ICU doors, tall enough that he had to lower his head slightly, shoulders so wide he seemed to make the doorway smaller, and he placed a classified file on the nearest monitor. His uniform carried the quiet weight of someone who'd killed people and would kill people again if necessary. He looked at Sarah like she was a photograph he'd studied for 20 years and finally found in person. "Senior Chief Chen," he said, and his voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low and dangerous and patient. "Your service record. We need to put it in the room." He nodded to the assembled staff, to the news cameras that had somehow materialized in the last 90 seconds, to the hospital board members who'd driven in when word spread that federal agents had brought a prisoner to the ICU. 2 silver stars. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart across for Tours. The last one took shrapnel in the left shoulder. Sarah's hand moved to her left shoulder without thinking. Muscle memory. 18 years of hiding the scar beneath scrubs and jacket lining. The SEAL commander continued, "Senior Chief Chen personally extracted 17 friendly personnel under fire in Helmand province. She operated medical trauma procedures in combat zones, needle decompression, emergency tracheostomy, femoral artery clamping. She did it with no backup, no air support, no guarantee she'd walk out alive." He paused. His jaw was the kind that could cut glass, and his eyes had seen things that made Sterling's recreational cruelty look like a child's tantrum. "The patient she saved 3 days ago? The tension pneumothorax? She performed that same procedure 43 times in combat. 43 times, under fire, with rounds hitting the walls around her." Dr. Sterling's face had drained to the color of old milk. The Admiral entered then, and the room contracted. His presence made the air pressure change. He wore the insignia of someone who commanded fleets, who could level countries, and he was flanked by board members who looked like they were witnessing their futures collapsing in real time. Beside him walked Janet Wilcox, the hospital's chief administrator, and behind them moved FBI agents with badges that caught the fluorescent light like teeth. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of military command structure, of 27 years of absolute authority. "Dr. Sterling, you are hereby relieved of all duties, effective immediately, for the termination of a decorated Naval Special Warfare operator. Your credentials are under review by the Colorado Medical Board." Federal investigators have been examining the financial records, Senior Chief Chen flagged. He nodded to the federal agents, who stepped forward with folders the thickness of textbooks. Duplicate billing codes. Inflated equipment orders. A 3-year pattern of kickbacks from Apex Medical Supply totaling $847,000. Sterling's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. Additionally, the Admiral continued, his tone never changing, never rising, "You brought in outside investigators to discredit Senior Chief Chen. Thomas Chen, the outside investigator you hired, was asked to verify her credentials." A man in a dark suit stepped forward, visible disgust etched into every line of his face. "Thomas Chen is standing here to inform you that every reference checked out. Every single one. Including her naval service record, which is publicly available to anyone who bothered to look." The investigator shook his head slowly. "I was hired under false pretenses. I was hired to build a case against someone whose background is impeccable." The news cameras pivoted toward Sterling like predators sensing blood. Janet Wilcox stepped forward, and her voice shook with the fury of someone who'd trusted him. "Security will escort you from this building immediately, Dr. Sterling. You are banned from all hospital property pending criminal investigation." She nodded to 2 security officers standing by the door. "Your badge, your credentials, and your access codes. Now." Sterling's hands trembled. His voice cracked when he tried to speak. "I was protecting the hospital from." She performed an unauthorized. The SEAL commander cut him off like an airlock slamming shut. She performed a needle decompression that saved a patient's life. A procedure she has performed under active fire in combat zones 43 times. A procedure you didn't even recognize was necessary. His voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. You looked at a decorated operator and saw a threat. You saw someone quiet and assumed she was weak. You made the mistake every predator makes. You picked someone who'd already survived the worst you could do. Security moved toward Sterling. He tried to walk backward, tried to maintain some dignity, but his legs seemed to belong to someone else. The room watched, 63 staff members, federal agents, the Admiral, a Navy SEAL commander, news cameras recording every moment, every step, as Sterling was escorted out through the ICU. His badge clattered to the tile floor. Someone stepped over it. No one picked it up. When the doors closed behind him, the Admiral turned to Sarah, and his expression softened in a way that suggested he'd been trained to contain explosions inside his chest. "Senior Chief, the Navy formally requests your presence at a Pentagon ceremony in Arlington. There's a Navy Cross you never accepted in 2006. Your daughter should see her mother receive it." Emma was standing in the ICU doorway, Sarah's daughter, 12 years old, finally understanding why her mother checked every lock twice, why loud noises made her freeze, why she'd chosen the quiet invisibility of night shift nursing to heal instead of lead. Tears were streaming down Emma's face. She looked at her mother like she was seeing her for the first time. Marcus Webb stood at attention, refusing to lower his salute. Sarah returned it, and in that moment, hand rising to her forehead, spine straightening, the nurse's uniform suddenly feeling like tactical gear, something shifted. The invisible woman became visible. The quiet voice became command. The mask dropped, and what remained beneath was quiet power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it had already survived everything. "I'm going on break," Sarah said to Janet Wilcox, and there was dark humor in it, the dry wit of someone who'd ordered airstrikes and now worked night shift, who'd commanded teams through firefights and now restocked medication trays. "But I'll be back." 6 months later. a strip mall parking lot in Aurora, Colorado. Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table between a cell phone repair kiosk and a discount vitamin store, wearing a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo stitched across the chest. His sign read supplemental insurance, ask me how to save. He'd gained weight, his eyes hollow, watching people walk past without stopping. A former Mercy General nurse recognized him, pulled out her phone, took a photograph that would be shared in 3 different hospital staff group chats within minutes. He looked like a man who'd woken up in someone else's life and couldn't find the exit. The Pentagon, Arlington, Ceremony Hall. Sarah Chen stood in dress whites, her uniform pressed so sharply it could cut, the Navy cross already pinned to her chest by the Admiral. Her daughter Emma stood beside her, trembling, touching the medal gently as if it might disappear. Marcus Webb sat front row in his marine dress blues, his unit behind him, his salute sharp enough to draw blood. The Admiral read the citation for extraordinary heroism in combat operations, repeatedly exposing herself to enemy fire to protect and extract friendly forces, and for eliminating a terrorist network responsible for 63 American casualties. The cameras flashed. Sarah stood motionless, the trembling gone, replaced by the measured breath she'd always taken, but now she didn't need to hide what it steadied. Emma's hands found her shoulder, and Sarah turned to look at her daughter's face. She saw recognition there, not shame, but pride. The kind of pride that comes from understanding your mother was never weak. She was just strategic about when to reveal her strength. Back at Mercy General, nursing students sat in a classroom waiting for their new director of emergency medical services to teach a lecture on trauma response and ethical medical practice. Sarah walked in, and without preamble, she opened her white jacket to show them the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the colors worn nearly invisible by time and handling, the stitching done by her own hands on the night of her last deployment. Combat medicine taught me something civilian medicine sometimes forgets, she said, her voice steady and clear. Healing takes many forms. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes instead of guns. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. She closed the jacket. Any questions? Marcus Webb's voice came through in interview footage that would later appear in hospital training materials. She saved my life twice. Once in Kandahar when I was 8 years old and she shielded me during a market bombing. And again by showing me that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form. If you made it this far, you understand why Sarah Chen was never just a nurse. Subscribe, like, and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history. And ask yourself, who in your life might be hiding strength you can't see?